On behalf of BioIT World's Global Web Symposia series, I'd like to welcome you to Next Generation Data Repository for Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacometrics. This webinar is brought to you by Terra, the global leader in model-informed drug development, regulatory science, real-world evidence, and market access. My name is Elizabeth Lamb, and I'm the host and moderator for today's event. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. He is Kevin Trim, Senior Director of Product Strategy for Terra. Welcome, Kevin. The presenter ball is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you, everybody, for joining. It is my pleasure to speak to you today about Terra Integral, our new product that will be released at the end of July, our next generation data repository for clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics. So the situation that we found ourselves in as Terra, a global leader in PK/PD modeling and simulation, is that we've actually been doing and been a leader in this space for almost 30 years now. For about 20 of those years, we've had a 21 CFR Part 11 compliant data repository product, and we've actually been hosting that as a software as a service for something like 10 or 12 years now. So we have a lot of experience in this space within clinical pharmacology, pharmacometrics, and hosting data in a Part 11 compliant way. But, given the changes within the industry, technology, and data science, we asked ourselves, what would a next generation data repository look like? And we started to gather these requirements, and the outcome has really been the design for what has become Terra Integral. So we basically organized the requirements into 6 feature categories. The first is, how will we organize the data? Second, how will these data be accessible? Third, finding and the ability to find and visualize those data once they've been stored in the repository. Again, to maintain the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance of those data, as we're working in a very much regulated space. The fifth is the ability to track those data for traceability and reproducibility, even beyond what Part 11 is requiring us to do. And finally, the performance and usability of the solution. So let's begin with the way that the data are organized. So what we found is that we would have to provide a basic standardized root folder structure. There's, a need and desire, I think, within many companies to organize data in their own way, but rather than making it, completely open, we decided we would provide a stable backbone, and then below that backbone, or even beside the backbone, allow for customizable folder structure so that it could mimic the way that companies are used to storing data. So the base elements of the data organization we've organized into, first being the study. So all data in a clinical pharmacology scenario are ultimately going to be collected within the context of a study. So study is really the base unit, and it's studies that people submit to regulators as part of the drug approval process. That being said, though, we know that when people are working, they're not always working on a study per se. They're sometimes working on a project. So they're working on some kind of question that they're trying to answer that actually spans beyond the question of, or the hypothesis of, one study. So they may be doing translational medicine and want to do allometric scaling, or something where you're using data from across studies to answer additional questions. So we allow for this kind of concept within a project. Within both the study and the project, we introduce the concept of an experiment. And the experiment, which I'll talk about in greater detail as we go through the presentation, is really the base unit, the base analytical unit. So this is where we're doing an analysis. We're using data, we're using models, different collateral in order to perform an analysis. This is what we call an experiment, and we treat this in a very specific way. And, it's this organization that was necessary in order to do some of the more sophisticated data tracking that we'll describe later as we move through the presentation. And then, of course, it's important to have data folders. where we're storing data, and we know that those are repositories for data, as well as libraries. And these would typically be used for models that we want to be able to reuse for multiple projects. And so, like I said, we allow this customization below these or beside these root level folders. And we allow for users to specify free-form metadata as well as predetermined metadata, and also add comments to any folders that they wish, all of which can be filtered upon and facilitating the user to find this information after it's been saved to the repository. So in terms of being able to access the data, we did feel that it was important to be online. If we're going to be able to host a solution for customers, this is something we're going to need to be able to do online. There's a lot of advantages to do that. One of the most important, I think, is that of collaboration. So today, in today's drug development world, people are using contract research organizations, they're using consultants in order to perform their drug development. It's very difficult for any one company to perform this completely in isolation within the walls of their own company. And so people need ways to collaborate with data. People set up these secure FTP sites, and there's different ways, portals that people use to transfer data back and forth. But ultimately, those sites or transfer places are not where those data will ultimately live. And if you want to have a good traceability of data, wouldn't it be nice to be able to use your repository as a mechanism for transferring data, or for even tracking data for which your partners are, analyses that your partners are performing for you. So instead of putting data in a secure portal, why not have your partner put the data directly into the repository so that you can have a closed chain of custody of those data once received? Any analyses or actions that take place associated with those data going forward can be tracked and traced back to the original source of the truth where those data were actually placed. So you can imagine bioanalytical data, you can use this as a mechanism to transfer that. But even the analysis itself, if you're using consultants or outside partners to perform analyses, you can actually require that those partners perform the analysis within your environment so that you can really have a true ownership over the data and have complete transparency for how results were obtained and what was the evolution of the analysis, and so permitting a complete oversight over that process. This, maybe I'll skip down to the last point, as that leads into, if I'm using this repository as a way to collaborate with my partners, what kind of control can we have over security, roles and groups, etc. So all of this is actually built into the repository. The owner of the repository can easily control for any user with access to the repository what they actually have access to. This can be done at the individual level. It can also be done more simply and efficiently by using groupings. So you can assign users to a certain group that will give them automatic permissions to do certain things. We also have different license types that do restrict certain activities from, for example, a partner from the beginning, so that you could never accidentally give more access to a partner than you would want to. So a lot of the security and is actually built into the application. And this includes things like the ability to blind data. So in many clinical trials, there are certain contributors who need to be blinded from certain elements of that trial. This is completely possible within the repository, as well as archiving. And under GXP, it is necessary to maintain a certain workflow when it comes to archiving. Electronic archiving has to sort of emulate physical archiving, where there needs to be an archivist role, where only a person with that role is actually able to take anything out of the archives. So in a physical archive, that's a building with boxes and folders within it. in the electronic repository, this is really just locking the data so that those data remain searchable and viewable by anybody who wants to see them, but they cannot be changed unless they become unlocked by an archivist. So with all of our regulatory experience within Terra, we were able to anticipate all of these needs and build them directly into the application. So when it comes to finding and visualizing data, people have, over the years, are now accumulating a lot of data for a lot of compounds, and often those data, as time passes, are not necessarily accessible to them or not in an easy way. So we did a number of things to make this easier for customers. One of them is simply to include viewing panes within the application. So there's a web app for this repository, and you can simply click on a file, and within the viewing pane of the repository, immediately see the content of that file. A lot of other historical applications require really downloading file or some content from the repository, opening it up in a third-party application in order to be able to read the content. This application will in fact read most file types. If it's rich text or even images, all these things can be seen by simply clicking on the file and seeing the content of it directly in the application. For searchability, this technology is actually built upon Amazon Web Services, and along with Amazon Web Services, you get this functionality of Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is a lot like a Google search that most people are familiar with, and it allows you to search the repository by entering keywords. And it's not only searching the metadata or the file names or the folder names, it's actually going inside the files to search and read the files and look for those keywords. So you should really be able to find anything you want in the repository. And then, if we're getting too many hits, actually filter that down in order to see more clearly what you're looking for and to isolate exactly what it is that you're trying to find. And of course, we have, when I mentioned before, we have all this metadata that you can attach to things within the repository. So of course, we allow for you being able to filter and query those metadata themselves. I'll just skip again to the bottom for the favorites. This is a simple thing, but I think it's an important thing that you be able to tag things that you've looked at recently in the repository and create your own personalized favorites list, so that every time you come to the repository, you're not necessarily having to do a search. You can quickly go to a short list of things that you'd like to see and continue your work in the repository. But I think probably the most transformational thing that we did in terms of being able to find and visualize data is this ability for the repository, when the user is uploading CDIS domains, give the user the ability to flag that as a CDIS domain, whether it be SDTM or send, and then we have algorithms within the application that will automatically transfer those data into a database relational table, which will allow for data mining down the road. So, CDISC is something which is now mandated for both preclinical and clinical data. So these are files that all customers need to make anyways, part of an electronic submission. So this is collateral that people have. So, and these are files that they're also going to want to save and store as something that they have submitted as part of a regulatory submission. So since they're doing that, and since we now have a universal data model that CDISC provides, including controlled terminology, let's utilize that so that we can actually do real data mining on clinical pharmacology data, which is something that up until now, we really have not been able to do. Or if certain sponsors have been able to accomplish this, they've had to go to extreme lengths internally in order to accomplish that. And this is sort of an out-of-the-box solution that will leverage a data standard that everybody's using anyway to provide that functionality. And in terms of being able to store the data in relational tables, that's all well and good, but Terra also has a technology called D360, which is a technology specifically designed for querying databases and having these sort of canned visualizations and tables according to the kinds of questions that any given scientific domain may want to ask. And so we actually have a configuration of this D360 technology that will allow really for any user to perform queries on their database and have meaningful, instantaneous tabulations and graphical representations of those questions, the answers to their questions within seconds, rather than having to go to a DBA and write sort of a SQL query. We have this ability to have that sort of layered on top of this database as an option. So that's something that's really quite unique and transformational that we've done within Terra Integral. So 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, this is not something that's new. It's been around for more than 20 years now as a guidance from the FDA. Just a quick overview of really what that entails, because often people do get confused about what is really 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. And even sometimes we've seen in industry, people are claiming this sort of compliance. And, in one way or another, they're not actually quite accomplishing it. So essentially what we want to see here, and this is a summary or a paraphrase, is that for every create, modify, and delete action, you actually do need an electronic signature. Something that's often forgotten is that you can't inherit an authentication from when you originally signed into the application for all of these activities as you perform them within a single session. It actually does require that for every unique action within a continuous session that you re-authenticate. And so, a lot of these authentication technologies that are out there, they're not actually anticipating that. They assume that you want a sort of single sign-on. But in fact, in order to comply with Part 11, you do have to reconfigure that to make it work to meet this requirement. And so that's obviously something that we've done. Then, of course, Audit Trails is an important part of Part 11, really trying to detail the who, when, why, and what of any of these activities performed by a user. The who and when are not too difficult to accomplish. The why is simply prompting the user to enter a reason for a change at the time of the change. The what is a little bit more difficult because what changed between two versions of a file can be something difficult to track. In our historical PKS solution, we actually used a relational table for the concentration data in order to do that. That could be quite a time and resource consuming methodology. So what we've done this time around is implemented basically a diff on the data. So, asking users to store the data as text, like a CSV file, for example, and then we can perform a diff on that in order to say, what is really the change from one version to another, and showing only the changes. And this is something we can do as sort of a reporting functionality that is very quick and efficient and not resource expensive. So that's all been designed and implemented to Terra Integral. And part of this is actually what we went over before without actually running the report for an audit trail. A user, an auditor, for example, within the viewing panes of the application can actually see two different versions of a text file and quickly see the differences between them within the viewing panes. And it'll highlight in a color-coded sort of way to show the user the differences between two files. So this is something, this is a technology that we're actually leveraging to do that. And, we also allow up at the parent folder level to sort of perform this audit trail on all the content of the folder. So you don't have to go file by file to request an audit trail. You can do it at a higher level and have a complete audit trail for all contents. And of course, versioning is an important part of Part 11. We do retain though all the previous versions, not just the diffs. Some of these source control applications, when they're versioning, they're just actually retaining the differences between files. We are retaining the actual complete version. And then we also allow for the user to select so that they can actually drill down. Instead of having all the differences, they can just select which two versions and any two versions in order to have that diff. So the audit trails facilitate all this sort of functionality. So what about tracking data beyond that? So I mentioned before that we have the concept of an analytical experiment within the repository. And really what that allows us to do is not just track individual versions of files, but also a collection of files and folders and content that the user can specify as related to one another. And this is what is assumed when you store information within an experiment. So there's automatic dependencies set up on each of these items so that we can return to what's called a save point within the application. So this is a concept that's been around for a while in software development, but hasn't really been used within sort of model development or within the clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics space, where you can actually return to a version of an analysis and see that what results came from that version of the analysis, regardless of what version the different files were. To say, that's my experiment. You know, in legacy PKS, we used to call that a scenario. And then you can reload that save point and reproduce the same results, for example, that you may have submitted to a regulator. So that is all leveraging these dependencies. So what happens within that experiment is there's an automatic dependency set up between files, and if anything changes, one file changes, the entire experiment becomes out of date, so that if you have a source file, for example, located within one study and you're working within a project, if that source file changes, the system will notify you that the results that you used and that you've generated from that experiment are now out of date, which gives you the opportunity to rerun your analysis using the updated data and bring everything back into currency. So the database is actually monitoring those dependencies and automatically notifying the users of those changes. And you know, we also allow for the user to set up personalized notifications as well, so that you can set your own dependencies even outside of an experiment, and just set up other, you know, user-specified notifications as a mechanism to communicate as reminders for yourself or with other users. An important concept in a repository that's quite critical is the difference between linking and copying. So copying is really taking a file and then using as a template to start the new identity of a new file. Because once you have a copy and it has its own identity, it really has to be tracked separately. And often mistakes that can occur in analyzing data is that people are copying files from here or there and using them and then not realizing that the original file may have changed, or even potentially corrupting the file during the copying process. And so, you know, copying is something that you need to retain because people may want that sort of functionality. But I think it's even more important to introduce the concept of linking, so that if you want to use a file, it's not necessary to copy it to another location, but you can simply link to it, which will allow for the file to remain as a single source of the truth, and then all analyses, and it could be hundreds of analyses that are leveraging that single file, all link back to it. And if that file were to ever change at its origin, all of those results would become out of date and everyone would be notified at the same time. So it's quite an important concept. And finally, we're at performance and usability. So one way to accomplish good performance and is a side effect of putting things into the cloud is the fact that you get this variable infrastructure. So you know, variable infrastructure is really something that can only be accomplished in the cloud, Within a physical data center, we don't have this kind of the ability to respond to load, which is just really, adding resources if and when they're needed. And so this is something that can be architected in the cloud, and AWS provides all the tools that allow you to do this. And so this is an important concept for usability and performance. It's also worth mentioning that this application is not limited to users of the sort of PK/PD data space. It is fit for that purpose, but it's also generalizable to the larger drug development industry. It's worth mentioning that it's not only for data. It's, I mentioned before that the way that we're tracking what happened to data or what changed between two different versions of data, we're actually storing those data as text files in order to perform a diff. That could be just as easily used for models or any kind of script. You could store those models in the repository and track them and validate them there and use them from that location. And, it's really any file type, including, Word documents or any kind of file you want to store in the repository. You can leverage those things that we've done outside of the use cases of clinical pharmacologists. And that automatic transformation of CDIS domains to relational tables, that is, again, something which is transferable outside of the clin pharm space, because CDISC is really for the entire clinical trial, not just the contribution of the clinical pharmacologist. And there are many domains. I think SCTM has 23 domains, and some of them are used by clinical pharmacology, but obviously there are many more domains out there. And this functionality could actually be extended to those domains as well. We understood that it was important to have an intuitive and familiar interface. People are used to storing information in folders, whether it be on servers or SharePoint or that sort of thing. And so we do have the ability, the interface that we've designed really mimics that familiar behavior of storing things in folders. And so it's not a foreign interface. It's something that people are used to experiencing. And then finally, having the application validated and maintained by an experienced vendor. One of the challenges with implementing data repository is all the validation and testing and maintenance that goes into it to make sure that it's still secure and you're not having security breaches and so forth. To work with a vendor who's been doing that for 20 years and has the ability to do that. And I mean, the value of just having it validated, a lot of what's involved in computer system validation for really any application revolves around what happens to the data that it's producing, how is it secured, how is it tracked, all of the Part 11 compliant component. This can all be handled within the validation that Terra provides for the application. So before summarizing, I just want to go back to the accessing of the data, because there's a component that I sort of skipped over as I went down to security roles and groups. So one way to access the repositories that we've used historically with PKS is providing a plugin from Phoenix to the repository. And that's easy enough to do. And of course, we'll continue to do that with our Workbench software, Phoenix and even Piranha. However, we wanted to make sure that the application was really agnostic so that it's not specific to Terra software, so that you could really use this, have the benefit of this repository using any kind of application, really so that it be completely agnostic. So what we've done is we've developed what we're calling a client application, which is an application that's free for download from the Terra website. And what it does essentially is allows you a portal to the repository so that you can achieve all the same things that you could in a plugin without having your application needing to directly connect to the repository. And so the way this works is you basically have this application, and through it, you can access the repository. It goes through the URL, and you can authenticate through it, download information, data, studies, libraries, what have you, from the repository into your own working environment, so onto your workstation. And this application will track all the things that you're doing with those data, whatever that collateral is, within your workstation. And then you can eventually push it back up into the repository. The repository will accept it as the next version, for example, of that experiment that you were performing, and track and have all the Part 11 and all the sophisticated data tracking that I've described. It can supply all of that functionality. So this works much in the same way as something like OneDrive or Dropbox, but instead of it being a real-time synchronization over the internet, which would result in a lot of different versions, if we're talking about experiments in a Part 11 compliant repository. So instead, these are intentional commits that the user would do between their workstation and the repository. And so during that synchronization, it's important to have interactive conflict resolution. So if there are differences between content in the repository and content on the workstation, we can resolve those differences to make sure that we're not overwriting things or losing things unintentionally. It's also important to be able, as you're committing things back to the repository, to do it as an all or nothing, which is often referred to as an atomic commit. So either things will be committed as a whole or not at all, so that we don't break that synchronization, for example, if you lose a connection to the internet in the process of doing that synchronization. And basically, like I mentioned before, what this client application does is allow you to use really any analytical tool or any third-party software to interact with the repository, rather than having it being specific to something that we've developed with a plugin. It's also worth mentioning that we'll be publishing the API for Integral, and so you could actually create plugins yourselves for connectivity with other databases or other applications directly in order to facilitate access to the contents of the repository. So that is, I think, a quick summary of all the functionality that's in there. We've got this graphical representation of the way the repository works. If you like, we can begin from the workstation. So from the workstation, you could either launch the web app and gain access to the repository, or as I said, you could use the client application to download content from the repository, whether it be from a library folder, study, project, data folder, wherever that might be, bring it down into the workstation, and then you can use any kind of application here that you want to interact with those data, analyze those data, create results from those data, and then push everything back into the repository via the client app, which allows full compliance and traceability of all the work that you've done. I mentioned that this is built on AWS technology, and that we have, once you have content within the repository, we have this concept of linking data together in addition to copying data files, creating dependencies within an experiment, or taking data that originates from a study and building a project from those data. We have the ability to search using the Elasticsearch within the repository to find the things that you're looking for, specify things as favorites. We have the ability to access the repository using plugins from the Terra Workbench applications such as Phoenix and Piranha, as well as the other external sources via the API. And again, if we allow the user to specify data that they've uploaded to the repository as a CDIS domain, and then in an XPT format, we automatically transfer that into our database, where then we can utilize D360 to layer on top to perform these mining and visualizations of those data. Of course, we have the audit trail, getting down to the who, when, why, and even the what, as well as the electronic signatures to provide authentication for whoever's making changes within the repository. So with that, Elizabeth, I think we can open it up to some questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We've had several questions come in, but we'll get started with those we have. Our first question, I'm an existing PKS customer. When I switch over to Integral, what happens to all those studies I have stored in PKS?
Okay, so that's good to hear that we've got some existing PKS customers online. So in addition to the folders that I've actually shared with you, we actually have one other root folder type, which we're calling the legacy PKS folder type. So if you have data currently stored in PKS, we are able to migrate those data into Integral. We actually spent significant additional time in developing the application to accommodate this so that we could provide that same functionality that you have today in PKS within the new application. So all the functionality that you have in PKS and all that structure that you've been used to seeing over the years, that structure can coexist inside of Integral, and we have set it up so that that migration is actually quite straightforward. And in fact, something that we've agreed, I'm not sure the company where this customer is working at, but just so you know, we have tried to communicate to customers that migration is something that Terra will actually do for free for any legacy PKS customers. So switching over to Integral should really come at no cost in terms of migration and should not result in any lost functionality whatsoever.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question, what assurances can Terra provide that my data will be secure within its environment? Okay,
so that's a good question. So I've already mentioned that AWS is the technology that we're using. In my experience in talking to various customers of Terra, most companies have already qualified AWS as a vendor, as most companies do have their own virtual private AWS clouds. So Terra has done the same. We've qualified AWS as a vendor, and so there's a certain amount of security that basically is inherent to AWS. And from my feedback from the industry is that everyone's pretty much satisfied that AWS can match whatever security that they would be able to accomplish using their own internal data center. So I think that part's equivalent. But then it comes to the application itself, because Terra has built, it's one thing to use AWS technology, but Terra has now built an application on top of that. And so Terra is responsible to make sure that the access to that content is really controlled. And so, Terra is a professional software development company. We have a lot of experience with doing that. But one of the assurances that we can provide, because we're actually anticipating this question, is that we've hired top-tier internet security firm to actually do penetration testing on this application. And, they actually found a few minor things which we were able to resolve. And this is a report that we have from this company that we would share with any Integral customer to demonstrate that we have done the due diligence, and that, if this top-tier internet security firm isn't able to hack into the system, I think that gives quite good confidence that nobody else would be able to do so either. And so, that penetration testing is sort of outside penetration testing, so a user with no credentials whatsoever, their inability to get inside, but also to have, we've also given them the scenario where they do have credentials, they're able to log into the system as a user, but then we've proven that they've not been able to break it from within. So that's, additional level of security. So those are all things that we can share with anybody who's interested in becoming an Integral customer. Maybe one other thing to mention is the fact that each customer within Integral does have a completely separate database schema. So we're not, amalgamating all the different customer data into one giant schema in the Oracle database. Every customer actually has their own. And so there is that sort of logical separation as well, so that it's not really possible for one customer to ever see the data of another, even if it is a multi-tenant solution, because we're using that architecture.
This person is wanting you to think outside the box. Is there any utility for Integral outside of clinical pharmacology?
Yeah, so that question may have come in before that very last slide. So ultimately, I mean, we have certainly designed this application with our current customer base in mind to make sure that we've covered all the use cases and scenarios that we could imagine for those customers. But that being said, we're also thinking at the same time that this is an investment that a company is going to make, and if they're making this sort of enterprise level investment, we want to make sure that other people within the organization would be able to leverage this technology as well. So we do feel that we've designed it in a fairly agnostic way so that really anybody within drug development, at least, would find utility in this application. So, and I mentioned this whole business of, having these algorithms that transform CDIS domains into data represented within a relational table in the database. This has obvious benefits for the clinical pharmacology data, but it does really go beyond allowing really Integral to behave as a clinical data repository so that, any kind of user, anybody who's interested in drug development or looking at those kind of data, if they're storing their data in this repository, they would have that ability to have these, configured D360 configurations or implementations that would allow them to ask, their specific domain questions and interrogate the data in their own individual ways in order to get access to those historical data that can help in decision-making within drug development. So we do actually feel that it does go beyond the clinical pharmacology audience and to the larger drug development audience.
Thank you. Our next question. As a pharmacometrician, I've never been asked to comply with Part 11. Do I really need a solution like this?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So Part 11 has been mainly focused on the sort of NCA component of clinical pharmacology submissions, historically at least, because 20 years ago that's pretty much all that there was. But that being said, everyone, if you're a pharmacometrician, you're aware that these analyses that you're doing are more frequently being included as part of regulatory submissions. So, it's not unreasonable for regulators to want to have the same sort of traceability and visibility on those data that they've previously wanted to see with simply NCAs. And I mean, if you're going to be making decisions based on these analyses, then potentially they would want to see the same sort of rigor in terms of generating those results. And so, that would be the first point. The second point is, Part 11 is not only for regulatory submission, it's also a good internal tool. So knowing who generated the data, when did they generate it, having all the versions of an analysis in a traceable way, understanding the reasons for having a new version, and being able to see the differences between versions, those are all things that are institutionally valuable and actually go beyond the need of what, simply trying to rectify a requirement for the regulator. So those, and especially within pharmacometrics, those analyses can become quite complex where you're having, multiple, what we would call experiments, different analytical units, and you can create quite a complex decision tree to visualize all the different decision points that you've made and, different analyses, why you went where. And it's one thing to have a tree to display that, and our software, Piranha, has that functionality. But then being able to go back and reconstruct it and really show the results that are associated with that in an organized way and traceable way that you can return to, 5 years later, I think there's a lot of value in that as well. So that's, Part 11 is, something that regulators like to look at, but that value of being able to track things that you've done, as a permanent part of the record, I think there's a lot of value within organizations. Even if this never ends up as part of a regulatory submission, there's still quite a lot of value in doing that.
Perfect. Thank you. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned about using Integral to facilitate partnerships. How does that work? Do all of my CRO contributors need accounts?
Okay, yeah, so it's true that all the CRO contributors need accounts because we do, it's part of a compliance system, so you need to be able to account for anybody who contributed to the system and have an electronic signature associated with that person. So we do need to know the identity of that person. So, but let's make a distinction between an account and a license, which is, I think, maybe where that question might be originating. So for an account, you could have, multiple CRO partners, Quintiles, PPD, Covance, Charles River, and have, might be 50 people across those companies that would have accounts, depending on which part of the study that they're contributing to. But you don't need to have a license for all those people. That would be cost prohibitive, to say the least. So first of all, the partner licenses are already significantly discounted because we do want to encourage people to use this technology as a collaborative tool. So we're trying to create a licensing model that actually allows for that. So first of all, it's a very low cost for the partnership licenses. But in addition to that, the partner licenses can float between accounts. So the admin at the sponsor has the ability to move those licenses around from one account to another of the partnership type, so that, if you're working with one CRO one day, and then a month later you're working with a different CRO or even somebody else within that CRO, you don't have to buy a new license for each one of those partners. You're really just moving that license around to the different accounts, depending on who's active and contributing at that time. So there really is no barrier there in terms of cost, et cetera.
All right. Thank you very much. We do have several more questions from the audience, but we are running out of time. What I will do is compile those questions and send them along to Kevin via email, and you will receive your answer via email. So with that, I would like to thank you so much, Kevin Trim, for your presentation today. I'd like to thank Terra for sponsoring. And most of all, I'd like to thank those of you who came and spent this time with us. We know you're very busy and you have a lot of choices to make about how you spend that time, so we're very grateful you came and spent it with us. So on behalf of BioIT World's Global Web Symposia Series, thank you all so very much. I look forward to seeing you at future BioIT World Web Symposia. Have a great day.